Arthur dressed with more flair than usual for his little sister's birthday party. The outfit felt a bit too flashy for his taste, but it was a special occasion. After one last look in the mirror, he decided it was time to head downstairs. Sylvie, his bond and companion, was bouncing with excitement, eager to join him, but Arthur gently stopped her. He told her to stay in the room for the night. Her mood shifted instantly, her bright eyes dimmed in disappointment. Arthur walked over and softly stroked her head, trying to reassure her. He explained that Vincent had warned him there might be certain guests attending the party with hidden intentions, pretending to celebrate while actually keeping an eye on him. Arthur didn't want to take any risks. Still, to cheer her up, he promised to send back plenty of food. Sylvie lit up at that, her tail wagging with delight. Arthur smiled and made a small gesture of a high five to seal the promise before leaving. The ballroom inside Hellstay Manor had been beautifully decorated, glowing with warm light and filled with festive color. Arthur's role for the evening was to greet Ellie's young friends from her school, a task assigned by his mother. He wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but he put on a polite smile and welcomed each guest as they arrived. As he scanned the room, Arthur noticed Elijah nearby. Elijah was confidently chatting with a girl, boasting that he would soon be attending Xyrus Academy. His charm was thick, and with a wink, he boldly asked her out. But in the middle of his performance, his hand hit a wine glass, and it toppled, spilling its contents all over his shirt. For a second, Elijah froze in embarrassment, completely speechless. Arthur turned away, amused by the scene, but not fast enough. Elijah had already seen him. The two locked eyes, and Elijah made a face, clearly telling Arthur not to act like he hadn't seen anything. Just then, Reynolds, Arthur's father, raised his voice to announce that the special guests were arriving. Moments later, the sound of Eleanor's voice echoed through the hallway as she entered the manor. She was confused at first, asking her mother why they weren't going out for dinner as planned. But before she could finish her sentence, the lights burst to life. The chandelier above sparkled brilliantly, and the magical decorations around the room lit up in vibrant, colorful bursts. A chorus of voices shouted, "Surprise!" in perfect unison. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment. Confusion filled her face, then gave way to realization, and finally to sheer joy. Her eyes sparkled with happiness as the reality of the surprise set in. Before she could fully take it all in, her friends from school rushed toward her in a whirlwind of laughter, hugs, and cheerful birthday wishes. Their excitement filled the room and wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Then, amidst the celebration, Reynolds raised his glass and announced with pride that it would bring him great happiness to see his son and daughter begin the evening with the first dance. Eleanor's joy quickly faded into horror. The thought of dancing in front of everyone left her completely frozen, her face pale with panic. She hadn't prepared for this. Tabitha whispered curiously whether Arthur and Eleanor had practiced at all for the dance. Alice was clearly frustrated by the unexpected turn of events and silently blamed Reynolds for this surprise. Eleanor turned to her mother for help. She admitted she didn't know how to dance and asked what they should do. Just then, Arthur stepped forward with calm confidence. He walked toward his younger sister and extended a hand after removing his gloves, bowing gently. Without speaking, he offered her the reassurance she needed. Eleanor, still unsure but trusting her brother, nodded and placed her hand in his. The guests clapped as Arthur led her onto the makeshift dance floor. Reynolds signaled the musicians, who appeared from behind the stage holding their instruments, and the music began. Arthur guided Eleanor gently. His right hand held hers, and his left rested softly on her waist. They moved in sync, circling the floor gracefully. Her dress, a light coral shade, flowed elegantly with each step, following Arthur's lead like a wave. Tabitha, watching closely, seemed surprised and mentioned again that she didn't think they had practiced. Alice, still in disbelief, confirmed that they hadn't. Arthur remained steady and composed, leading the dance with elegance and skill. These movements came naturally to him, skills he had learned long ago during formal events as a king in his past life. Eleanor slowly relaxed. The fear on her face faded, replaced by joy. She began smiling brightly, enjoying each moment of the dance. As the song reached its final notes, Eleanor followed Arthur's movements perfectly. Together, they ended in flawless harmony, stopping just as the music faded. Applause and cheers erupted from the guests around them. Compliments poured in from every direction. Eleanor beamed with happiness, her face glowing from both pride and the joy of the moment. Just as the applause from the dance was dying down, Gideon made his way toward Arthur. His voice carried a playful, sarcastic tone as he praised the performance with exaggerated disgust, clearly drawing attention. Without waiting for a real response, he asked to speak with Arthur privately. Wanting to avoid a public conversation, Arthur quickly turned away and slipped out into the backyard, where the cool air felt like a breath of relief. But Gideon wasn't far behind. He followed him outside, clearly not willing to let Arthur go that easily. Gideon, as blunt blunt as ever, joked about Arthur acting like he was in a one-man play. Arthur, slightly annoyed, replied that he hoped Gideon hadn't crashed his sister's birthday party just to chase him down for a chat. But Gideon defended himself, claiming he had brought a gift for Eleanor too. Arthur didn't seem convinced, but gave in, asking what brought the continent's most famous artificer to him. Gideon smirked, pretending to be offended by the sarcastic compliment. He then revealed that the council, the former monarchs of Dicathen, who now ruled jointly, had approved the designs he had refined from Arthur's original blueprint. The massive project was already under construction. Arthur gave a simple congratulation, clearly aware that Gideon had likely earned a great deal from the council's approval. But Gideon dismissed the idea of chasing money, fame, or power. To him, those were only tools. His goals went beyond what even the council could offer. Before he could elaborate further, a group of excited children ran up, clearly starstruck. They gushed over Gideon's legendary work, especially the enormous ship he had designed. Gideon tried to brush them off politely, stating he was busy, but the attention pulled him away nonetheless. Before leaving, he quickly turned to Arthur and warned him not to leave. Arthur didn't stay. He slipped away again, his thoughts drifting as he walked. He reminded himself that fame wasn't just a means to an end. It came with its own weight, its own cost. Eventually, Arthur found a quiet spot in the corner of the backyard, holding a glass of apple cider. The noise of the party softened in the background. From a distance, he noticed Lilia, who had just arrived, waving in his direction as she made her way toward Tim. On her way, she greeted Arthur, explaining that she had gotten to the party late because she wanted to congratulate Eleanor first. Arthur smiled and responded kindly, mentioning how her parents had already told him how busy she had been lately, especially as the secretary of the student council. Then he added that it had been a long time since they had spoken. Lilia paused, slightly nervous, and agreed. Inside, she couldn't help but notice how much taller Arthur seemed compared to before. It caught her off guard, as if she were seeing him in a new light. The conversation between them grew warmer. They shared stories, memories, and laughter. Arthur recalled how the timid girl who once used to sneak away from her parents to eat meals with the maids and butlers had now grown into a confident young woman. His words brought a flustered reaction from Lilia, who reminded him that she had once shown him her most precious secret hideout, and now he was still teasing her for it. Arthur couldn't help but smile. He admired how far she had come. After all the time she used to worry about her future, she was now doing remarkably well at one of the most prestigious mage academies in all of Dicathen. He noted how several boys had passed by during their conversation, throwing subtle, longing glances in her direction. Clearly, Lilia had become quite popular. Lilia, surprised and confused, denied any such thing. She insisted that she didn't even have a boyfriend and credited everything that had changed in her life to Arthur. Arthur responded with lighthearted confidence. If she truly meant that, then he joked that he should have the final say in any boy she chose to bring home, reminding her that he wouldn't be any less strict than her father, Vincent. That remark, though casual, seemed to affect Lilia. For just a moment, something in her expression dimmed, a flicker of disappointment or unspoken emotion, but she quickly masked it with a light-hearted agreement and brushed it off as if it meant nothing. Before the moment could linger, Gideon arrived. His approach was uncharacteristically polite, with a half-formed smile stretched across his face. He interrupted the conversation and asked to speak with Arthur. Though clearly caught off guard, Lilia kept her composure. She smiled courteously, waved goodbye to Arthur, and politely bowed to Gideon before heading back toward the crowd. As she disappeared into the party, Gideon, proud as ever, pointed out how well known he was. Clearly pleased with the attention he had drawn, Arthur gave a short response, unimpressed by the bragging. Gideon, however, turned the attention to Arthur. He commented on Lilia's earlier demeanor, suggesting she seemed to have a crush on him. Arthur didn't deny it. He took a calm sip from his drink, acknowledging what he already knew. But when Gideon asked if Arthur planned to act on it, Arthur's expression remained steady. He explained that Lilia's feelings weren't rooted in love. She had gone through a dramatic change in her life, one that Arthur had directly influenced. Because of that, what she felt for him now wasn't true affection. It was gratitude, admiration, perhaps even an illusion of romantic connection. But in time, Arthur believed she would realize the difference. What she was feeling now, he knew, was the kind of infatuation a young girl might have toward a hero who changed her fate, not the love born of genuine understanding. Gideon, ever blunt, couldn't help but mock Arthur's calm and mature way of handling emotional matters. He admitted it almost made him sick, but Arthur didn't respond to the sarcasm. He knew Gideon hadn't chased him through a party just to give relationship advice. There was something else. Finally, Gideon revealed his real reason for coming. He wanted to use the power, wealth, and recognition granted to him by the council to gain something far more valuable: Arthur's knowledge. What Gideon sought wasn't fame or fortune, it was understanding. The kind of understanding that could reshape entire civilizations. Arthur, however, didn't answer with excitement. He reminded Gideon that even sharing the blueprints for the steam engine had left him with doubts. He didn't want to interfere further with how the continent functioned. The world of Dicathen had its own pace, its own rhythm. rhythm. It was not Arthur's place to reshape it completely, but Gideon, sharp as ever, picked up on what Arthur didn't say. He caught on to the subtle hint. There were more ideas, more inventions locked away in Arthur's mind. His excitement betrayed him. It was clear he wanted access to that knowledge more than anything. Arthur noticed this immediately. Gideon only heard what he wanted to hear. Tired of the growing pressure, Arthur infused his voice with mana and delivered a warning, quiet and low, a growl only Gideon could hear. He made it clear that he wasn't there to fuel Gideon's personal curiosities or ambitions. The effect was immediate. Gideon actually flinched, startled by the sudden change in tone, but he recovered quickly. He backed off from demanding world-changing inventions and instead offered a compromise. He suggested a fair exchange. He would become Arthur's personal supplier, offering any artifacts or resources Arthur might need in return for the occasional chance to learn from him. Arthur thought for a moment, then extended his hand and smiled, his expression calm and sharp like a businessman. The two shook hands. The deal was made. The evening went on with laughter, dancing, drinks, and the final exchange of gifts. As the party wound down, Arthur watched his family gather near Eleanor. His parents, Reynolds and Alice, presented her with a special gift, elegant hair ties adorned with tiny ornamental bells. The gift was warm and heartfelt, but then Arthur noticed something else. Another present sat nearby, one that looked slightly different from the rest. Curious, Eleanor ran toward it with excitement and started unwrapping it. Alice asked whose gift it was, but Arthur replied that he wasn't sure. Inside the box, he found a letter addressed to Eleanor. He read it aloud. The message wasn't from a family member or a friend. It was from someone who clearly understood Eleanor's deep admiration for her brother. The writer gently urged her not to just look up to Arthur anymore, but to grow stronger and stand beside him as an equal. Eleanor's eyes widened as she pulled the gift from the box. It was a bow, not just any bow, but a beautifully crafted one. The design caught everyone's attention. Tabitha was quick to admire its beauty. Vincent, experienced in craftsmanship, recognized the delicate, elegant patterns. It looked like something from the Elven lands. Even Reynolds was puzzled, wondering who had sent such a meaningful and rare gift. Arthur stood quietly, lost in thought. There was something about the gift, its design, the letter, the intent behind it, that stirred a familiar feeling within him. But before he could dwell on it any longer, Eleanor called out to him with excitement, reminding him that she was still waiting for his gift. Alice gently scolded Eleanor for being too impatient, but her daughter simply giggled in response. Arthur smiled, handing Eleanor a small box. At the same time, he passed a second one to their mother. Eleanor tore through the wrapping paper with wide eyes and eager hands. Her expression lit up with amazement when she uncovered a delicate pendant, an enchanted necklace made with rare materials. It sparkled with a faint magical glow. Arthur calmly explained that the pendants were crafted to protect them, especially if he or Reynolds wasn't around to help in times of danger. Tabitha admired the craftsmanship, wondering aloud where Arthur had found such beautiful artifacts. Vincent revealed with pride that these pendants were the only ones of their kind in existence. Arthur leaned forward and tied the necklace around Eleanor's neck himself. She smiled brightly as he softly wished her a happy birthday. The moment was simple but filled with warmth and meaning. After the celebration ended, Arthur's days returned to their usual rhythm. Life became predictable and steady. Even his own birthday passed quietly. The twin horns, who had become like family, were unable to attend due to their ongoing exploration deep within the continent. Still, a letter from them reached the guild hall confirming that they were safe. Unlike Eleanor's grand celebration, Arthur's birthday was a quiet family affair. Just as he had requested, he had no complaints. It was enough. Over the following months, Arthur grew closer to Gideon. The old artificer, despite his odd habits and intense curiosity, had proven to be loyal and trustworthy. Their shared work and long discussions had slowly built a bond between them, one that neither would admit openly, but both had come to value. One day, Arthur was led to Gideon's personal workshop, a highly restricted facility that even most officials were not allowed to enter. Only council members and trusted employees were granted access. Gideon reminded Arthur of this fact repeatedly, clearly proud of the rare privilege he was offering. Arthur, slightly amused, responded with calm sarcasm. He had already heard the same reminder multiple times. Gideon accused him of being ungrateful and bored, pointing out that his face didn't show any excitement. Arthur replied that it was hard to stay enthusiastic when Gideon constantly hovered over every minor detail of their shared project. The two bickered like family. Gideon joked about their late-night calls and how they hadn't brought them any closer. Arthur, as always, pushed back with wit, telling the older man to go make friends his own age. Then Gideon changed the topic. He brought up Arthur's birthday, surprised at how quickly time had passed. It had already been over 4 months since Eleanor's party. He asked if Arthur's celebration had been just as extravagant. Arthur told him it hadn't. He had asked for something small, private, just family. Gideon, having seen how comfortable and social Arthur had been at Eleanor's gathering, found that surprising. But in the end, with a rare softness in his voice, Gideon wished him a late happy birthday. Arthur looked at the box Gideon handed him, curious. He asked what it was, but Gideon only told him to open it. Arthur raised an eyebrow as he took it from the old artificer, lightly teasing him about not even wrapping the gift. Gideon, pretending to be offended, demanded it back. Arthur laughed laughed and told him he was only joking. He opened the box, revealing a sleek, carefully crafted bracelet, an artifact specially made just for him. Arthur thanked Gideon sincerely, appreciating the work that had gone into it. Gideon shrugged it off, saying it was nothing compared to Arthur's help with the steam engine project. But then, his tone grew curious. He asked why Arthur wanted a bracelet that could hide not just one, but two elemental affinities. Jokingly, Gideon wondered if Arthur was secretly a quadra-elemental mage. Arthur casually confirmed it. He was, in fact, a quadra-elemental mage. Gideon froze. His face twisted in disbelief. The realization hit him hard. He immediately understood the significance. If Arthur wanted to hide half of his magical attributes, it meant he was planning to keep a part of his strength concealed. It also meant Arthur trusted him enough to reveal such a huge secret. Gideon asked why Arthur would even tell him something like that. Arthur just grinned and winked, saying that the more Gideon knew about how special he was, the more free things he could get out of him. Gideon groaned, frustrated at how casually Arthur dropped world-breaking news. Still, he demanded proof one day. Arthur promised he would show him eventually. Then, shifting the topic, he complimented Gideon on the speed of progress. He was impressed by how fast the steam-powered ship was coming together. Gideon confirmed that in just a few days, while Arthur would be heading off to Xyrus Academy for his first day, the massive ship, named the Dicathen, would be setting sail. As Arthur walked out of the workshop, his mind was deep in thought. Gideon truly was a genius. It was hard to believe that in just a few months, the old artificer had managed to design, coordinate, and begin construction on an entire steam engine ship. It was more than just impressive, it was astonishing. But Arthur knew that this ship, this technology, wasn't just for show. If the continent they were preparing to explore turned out to be hostile, he couldn't afford to stay complacent. He needed to continue growing stronger. The artifact Gideon had given him would help with that. Now that he could hide his fire and water attributes, it was time to focus more seriously on his earth and wind magic, pushing them closer to his other elements. Lost in those thoughts, Arthur wandered through the streets of the city, not paying attention to his surroundings. Suddenly, he bumped into someone. He quickly apologized, explaining that he was distracted, but the man he had walked into wasn't interested in apologies. He was tall and broad, flanked by two women. His attitude was crude, immediately insulting Arthur with a mocking sneer. Arthur didn't flinch. Inside, he sighed. Once again, he had crossed paths with the type of people he had no patience and trying to act like someone important. The man surrounded by two women used the smallest excuse to inflate his own importance. Claiming to be a professor at Xyrus Academy, he spoke down to Arthur, pretending to take moral responsibility for what he called Arthur's poor manners. He insulted Arthur's appearance, especially his long hair, saying that a real man should have short hair and visible muscles, like him. He continued ranting, demanding that Arthur apologize properly, on his knees. As the man moved to push Arthur down, he quickly found that he couldn't. His hand met resistance, and Arthur didn't budge an inch. Calmly, Arthur infused mana into his voice, just enough to carry a sharp edge of warning. He made it clear that he was willing to let this go, assuming the man was simply intoxicated. But he also made it clear his patience had limits. The professor froze, stunned by the power behind Arthur's voice. He quickly yanked his hand away, shaken by something he didn't fully understand. Realizing that Arthur wasn't just any passerby, the man barked back, still trying to hold on to his pride. He shouted that no one should dare speak to a professor of Xyrus Academy in that way, but Arthur didn't stop or react. He simply kept walking. The man, embarrassed and humiliated, shouted one final warning. If Arthur really was a student at Xyrus Academy, then he'd better stay out of sight, because next time he would be disciplined properly. In response, Arthur tossed something over his shoulder without even looking back. The item spun through the air and landed right in front of the man. It was a pendant, the Xyrus Academy emblem. The two girls standing beside the professor gasped in disbelief. They hadn't even seen Arthur take it off. One of them whispered in shock, recognizing it instantly. The professor stared at the pendant, confused and rattled. His thoughts raced. He hadn't even noticed when Arthur had slipped it off. Later that day, Arthur returned to the Hellstein Manor. As he stepped through the front gate, two familiar figures raced toward him, Sylvie and Eleanor. They leaped at him in pure joy, clearly excited to see him, but Arthur casually dodged their attempts to tackle him, stepping inside the house with a calm expression. He announced his return and asked where his parents were. Eleanor excitedly replied that Reynolds and Alice were in the living room with Elijah. She mentioned that a package had arrived from Xyrus Academy. Arthur made his way through the manor to the living room. Reynolds smiled wide and welcomed him back, holding up a box. Elijah, standing beside him, was equally thrilled. Inside were their new school uniforms. Alice handed Arthur his set with a warm smile. As he held the uniform in his hands, a quiet thought passed through his mind. His life had been many things: a lonely orphan, a king, a helpless infant, an adventurer. Now he was about to become a student. Each chapter had changed him. Each role had taught him something. He wondered what this next one, life as a student at Xyrus Academy, would bring. The world had already taught him so much, but it wasn't finished with him yet. Arthur's sleep was broken suddenly by a loud shout that cut through the quiet of morning. Just as he tried to sit up, Elijah seized his foot and dragged him upward. Groaning, Arthur instinctively grabbed the still sleeping Sylvie and tossed her toward his overexcited roommate, hoping she'd act as a shield. It worked. Sylvie, startled from her sleep, reacted as expected by clawing at Elijah's face in pure confusion. Elijah howled in pain, flailing as he tried to peel her off. Arthur, still half asleep but amused, muttered that he was awake and would be ready in 5 minutes. As Arthur pulled himself together, Elijah sat nearby, still rubbing the fresh scratches on his face. He couldn't stop himself from bringing up the choice Arthur had made, to attend Xyrus Academy as a scholar mage. It still didn't sit right with him, Arthur replied calmly, reminding Elijah that he had always wanted to learn more about the theory behind magic. He wasn't there to simply prove himself in battle. Of course, he hadn't abandoned combat completely. He still planned on taking some battle mage courses, but fighting kids his own age didn't excite him. Learning did. Elijah frowned, warning that scholar mages often weren't taken seriously by the battle mage crowd. Arthur only laughed and teased Elijah, asking if he was worried about him. Elijah quickly denied it. He wasn't worried for Arthur. He was worried for the poor students who might end up in the infirmary for underestimating him. Arthur promised to behave, though his smirk said otherwise. The two of them got dressed and headed downstairs, where the rest of the Hellstee family was waiting. Reynolds called out for them to hurry up and eat. Eleanor sat at the table, pouting with jealousy. She wanted to go to Xyrus Academy too. Arthur playfully told her to stop slacking on her training if she really wanted that dream. Meanwhile, Elijah turned to Alice and asked for help healing the scratches on his face. She laughed softly, already guessing that Sylvie had something to do with it. She motioned him over with a smile. Reynolds beamed with pride as he looked at Arthur, still trying to process the fact that his son was heading off to such a prestigious school. He told Alice it seemed they had raised him well, but Alice raised an eyebrow and corrected him. She had done the raising. Reynolds, with a sheepish smile, joking that the only time he seemed to raise his children was when they got into trouble. Alice simply nodded in agreement, her tone light but her point made. The maid stepped into the room and quietly announced that the carriage had arrived. It was time for Arthur to leave for Xyrus Academy. Arthur turned to his family, trying to keep his emotions in check. He gently patted Eleanor on the head and told her to behave and take care of their parents while he was away. Eleanor, hiding her feelings behind a casual response, nodded with a faint pout. Arthur reminded her about the protective pendants he had given, small but powerful artifacts to keep her safe. He made sure she wore them always. As he turned to go, Reynolds spoke up, pretending to sound offended. Arthur smiled and tossed back a teasing farewell, warning his father not to burn the house down during training. Reynolds laughed, proud and amused, calling his son a cheeky brat. Arthur climbed into the carriage and gave one last glance at the home he had grown up in. There was warmth in his chest as the memory of his family lingered in his mind. Though the journey to Xyrus Academy wasn't long, the weight of what awaited made it feel much farther. The academy stood in the same city, but once the carriage passed through the towering front gates, Arthur felt like he had stepped into a different world. The campus was enormous. Elijah stared in awe, his eyes wide with wonder. Arthur nudged him forward, encouraging him to keep moving as they followed the stream of new students. A senior student shouted instructions, telling everyone to form a line in front of a large white building ahead. This structure was carved with glowing runes and towered above the crowd, catching even Arthur by surprise with its magical presence and scale. Eventually, the boys reached the reception desk. The woman at the desk welcomed Elijah first, recognizing him as a battle mage candidate with Earth affinity. When she looked at Arthur's form, her expression changed. She stammered as she read it aloud. Earth and wind magic. Scholar mages usually didn't have dual affinities. Arthur calmly confirmed it, asking if there was a problem, but the receptionist, clearly flustered, quickly assured him there wasn't and told them to continue. Inside the grand hall, the noise was overwhelming. Students filled the room, voices bouncing off the walls as they chatted, laughed, and found seats. Some were clearly friends from before. Others were meeting for the first time. Elijah weaved through the rows of seats, politely squeezing past people as he found a spot. Meanwhile, Arthur heard whispers nearby. A few students, noticing his uniform, dismissed him as just another weak scholar mage. But as Arthur approached and asked to pass through, a sharp glare was enough to silence their words. The students quickly moved aside, intimidated by something in his presence. Arthur found a seat and looked around. The place buzzed with youthful energy. He had forgotten just how loud and chaotic this age group could be when packed together in one place. For a while, he simply observed. Then, his eyes turned to the stage, where a single podium stood alone. Without warning, a blur appeared on stage. As the haze cleared, Arthur recognized the familiar figure of Director Goodsky standing behind the podium, ready to begin the ceremony. Her eyes were calm but piercing, and they were locked directly on Arthur. A strange chill ran down his back. Without saying a word, Cynthia raised her hand slowly. Her gaze never wavered. Then, with a single snap of her fingers, the entire room went silent. Mouths still moved. Laughter and whispers continued, but no sound came out. It was like the noise had been sucked out of the building. All around him, students looked shocked, realizing they couldn't even hear their own voices. Arthur felt a quiet awe. He had known the director used sound magic, but her control was astonishing. She had cast a sound nullifying spell over the entire hall effortlessly. Cynthia Goodsky's voice then echoed through their minds. She spoke gently, explaining she disliked shouting due to her old age. She welcomed them all, the young scholars, warriors, and leaders of tomorrow, to Xyrus Academy. She introduced herself formally as the director and admitted she had almost given a long, boring speech. But this year, she said, was unlike any other. Her tone shifted with pride. For the first time since the founding of the academy, there were more elves and dwarves enrolled than ever before. The students applauded this rare unity, some clapping enthusiastically, others surprised by the announcement. She continued, saying that instead of delivering a lecture herself, it would be more fitting to allow those who represented the students to speak. With that, she introduced the student council. One by one, its members walked out from behind the stage. Elijah lit up as he spotted a familiar face, Lilia. He cheered loudly, pointing her out with excitement. Behind her came another tall figure with long, parted bangs. But it was the final arrival who left the crowd speechless. Arthur's eyes widened as he recognized her, Tessia Earlith. She walked with grace, confidence, and a maturity that didn't match the age Arthur had last known her. At just 13, she had already grown into someone poised and commanding. Even Sylvie, sitting quietly with Arthur, seemed to brighten as she saw her. The students around Arthur began whispering, their words tumbling over one another. Some called her the Princess of Eleanor. Others said she had been studying under Director Goodsky for a full year. A shocking fact considering the director's reputation for never taking on disciples. People couldn't stop staring, praising her beauty, her strength, and even her cold personality. Many of the boys, awestruck, whispered about what it would take to make her notice them. Then, Tessia stepped forward and began to speak. She introduced herself formally as Tessia Earlith, president of the student council, and congratulated everyone on their admittance to the finest magical institution on the continent. Though she was a first year like the rest, she had spent the past year observing the academy. She spoke about the discrimination that scholar mages had faced. She pointed out how something as small as a uniform had already created tension, and if such simple differences could divide them, what would happen when race and background came into play? Tessia urged them to break away from the mindset of the older generations, the mindset that had bred division and prejudice between humans, elves, and dwarves. Just as the royal families had united to form the council, she called on the students to do the same. They were the future, and it was their responsibility to change the course of history. When she finished, the silence didn't last long. The hall erupted into applause, cheers, and whistles. Sylvie, full of energy, squealed with joy, thinking she had spotted her mother. Arthur, exhausted by her enthusiasm, simply picked her up and wrapped his arms around her. There was no winning against her playful spirit. Meanwhile, Elijah had gone quiet beside him. Arthur glanced over, only to find him staring down in a daze, completely mesmerized by someone. Elijah's face was filled with awe. His breath nearly caught in his throat. Arthur raised an eyebrow, already guessing where this was going. Elijah, now dreamy-eyed, declared that he had fallen in love. Arthur sighed, knowing it wasn't the first time he'd heard this. In fact, Elijah had already confessed his love 4 different times during the short walk to the auditorium. Arthur reminded him of that, earning a dramatic protest from Elijah, who insisted this girl was different from the others. He seemed truly convinced this time, but Arthur wasn't buying it. He casually mentioned that the girl had changed quite a bit since they last saw her. Elijah immediately turned to Arthur in disbelief, now demanding to know how Arthur even recognized her. The frustration grew louder as Elijah recalled how Arthur also mysteriously knew royalty like Princess Kathleen and Prince Curtis. He grumbled about missing his invite to whatever secret club Arthur belonged to. Pushing Elijah away, Arthur called him a weirdo and kept walking. After the long ceremony, the students were dismissed to their respective dorms. Elijah, still recovering from the speech, complained about how boring it had been despite the important announcements. As they made their way across the campus, a few girls walking past them gave them shy glances, giggling with their friends. Elijah noticed, but Arthur paid no mind. Elijah couldn't understand it, how Arthur never seemed to react or care about the attention he received. To Elijah, it felt like a complete waste of good looks and charm. Just then, a loud explosion echoed across the open campus, startling everyone nearby. Without thinking, Arthur and Elijah rushed toward the source of the noise. But as they neared, Arthur slowed down. He recognized the type of situation almost immediately. It wasn't a real emergency, just 2 students in the middle of a heated argument. The noise had come from a duel declaration. A taller human student, full of arrogance, insulted a dwarf student's abilities, questioning his potential as an augmenter. He mocked him cruelly, telling him to stick to forging weapons rather than wielding them. The dwarf wasn't about to take that insult quietly and snapped back with fury. The human student introduced himself as Nicholas Dryle, dripping with condescension. He challenged the dwarf, whose name was Bronzen Boar, to a duel. Bronzen didn't back down and immediately accepted. Both students raised their hands to their uniform badges. In response to their challenge, the badges began to glow, one blue, one red, until the lights synced together with a loud ping, sealing the duel. Arthur observed the battle closely. From what he could tell, the artifacts issued by the school weren't just symbolic. These badges had real utility. During sanctioned portion duels, they could activate and form magical barriers to protect both the fighters and the spectators. It was an efficient way to allow students to spar safely while still encouraging real combat training. The concept intrigued him. Nicola Dryle, the human student, summoned a pair of dual swords from his dimensional ring. His stance showed confidence, even arrogance. On the other side, the dwarf, Bronzen Boar, pulled out a massive battle axe from his own ring and took a braced stance, ready to charge. The crowd watched eagerly as the duel began. Elijah couldn't help but shout encouragement toward the dwarf, which earned him a few annoyed looks from nearby students. Arthur, meanwhile, focused on the aura and technique of the fighters. Nicholas was a red core mage, still relatively early in his journey, but his control over his earth attribute mana was impressive. Bronzen, on the other hand, was still at the black core stage, which meant the odds weren't in his favor. Bronzen wasted no time. With a roar, he launched himself forward, using a nearby tree to push off and gain momentum. His axe shimmered with mana as he charged it with earth energy. The dwarf looked determined to close the gap quickly and strike hard. Nicholas met the charge head on. His dual swords dragged against the ground as he ran, scraping stone and dirt. As he lifted them, twin blades of condensed earth rose up from the path of his swing, following the arc of his weapons. Arthur analyzed the technique silently. Conjuring earth in such a form as an augmenter wasn't easy, especially not at red core. This boy had been trained, no doubt about it. Bronzen shouted a command and smashed the approaching earth blade. His body was surrounded by yellow light as his axe cleaved through the attack with brute force. The fragments scattered like shards of glass across the barrier. The dwarf didn't stop there. He gripped the head of his axe with his palm and sent another surge of mana through it. The weapon came crashing down with the power of what he called a tremor smash. The ground shook slightly as the force of the attack pushed Nicholas back several feet, but Nicholas quickly regained his footing. His expression remained smug as he darted back into striking distance. Once more, the dual swords scraped across the stone floor, creating another wave of earth blades. Bronzen blocked them, but this time he was a second too late. One of the earthen edges caught the side of his head, leaving a small cut. Fueled by frustration, the dwarf growled out an insult, accusing Nicholas of being a coward in the way he fought. Nicholas responded with action. He stomped the ground with force, and a thin pillar of stone erupted beneath Bronzen, hitting him squarely in the stomach. The dwarf's body rose off the ground with a choked sound, and then came crashing back down. The shield from his badge shimmered once before shattering. The duel was officially over, but it didn't stop there. Instead of backing off, Nicholas slowly walked toward Bronzen's fallen body. His expression wasn't one of victory, it was one of contempt. He taunted the dwarf, mocking him for his loss and throwing his size in his face. Elijah, watching from the side, sensed something wrong. The protective barrier had deactivated, meaning the duel had ended, but Nicholas clearly wasn't finished. Lifting his boot with cruel intent, he intended to stomp down, threatening to break the dwarf's arm, to remind everyone who held power. Elijah, witnessing this, flinched instinctively. A fire lit up inside him as he imagined himself rushing in to stop the violence, becoming a hero in the eyes of everyone watching. But before he could move, Arthur took a step ahead, though with a different approach. Arthur raised his voice intentionally loud enough for half the courtyard to hear, calling out a bluff. He claimed to see the student council president approaching. It had the exact effect he expected. Nicholas stopped instantly, his eyes darting around in panic. He quickly sheathed his blades back into his dimensional ring, straightened up, and looked over his shoulder anxiously. Arthur then shrugged with a casual grin, letting the lie land. He told him he was mistaken. Elijah let out a groan of betrayal. His moment of imagined glory had vanished, stolen before it began. As Arthur turned to walk away, a firm hand landed on his shoulder. Nicholas wasn't finished. He glared at Arthur, clearly humiliated and looking to reassert control. His tone was threatening, warning Arthur not to interfere again. Arthur responded calmly, pointing out that the duel had clearly ended long ago, and that continuing to attack after it was over wasn't just dishonorable, it wasn't allowed. Nicholas didn't care. He made it clear he'd remember this. Before leaving, he spat on the ground at Arthur's feet in disgust. But then something unexpected happened. Sylvie, still perched nearby, reacted with perfect timing. She aimed and spat a glob straight at the back of Nicholas's neck. The reaction was instant. Nicholas spun around, rage exploding in his expression. A vein pulsed visibly on his forehead. Arthur simply feigned innocence, keeping a relaxed expression as he insisted it wasn't him. But Nicholas didn't buy it. He reached into his dimensional ring once more, pulling out his swords again, ready to attack despite the consequences. Arthur, prepared to counter, was moments away from drawing mana and disarming him when a voice cut through the tension like lightning. That voice stopped Nicholas cold. It was Tessia Earlith, now accompanied by the other student council representatives. Her presence alone was enough to freeze the moment in place. Just moments earlier, Tessia had been walking through the campus halls with the council, but her thoughts had been elsewhere. She hadn't seen Arthur during the entrance ceremony and was beginning to wonder if he had skipped it entirely. Her mind wandered through various possibilities. Should she act friendly when she saw him? Should she play it cool? What if he found her first? The question spiraled in her head. Clive, the vice president, had to call her name multiple times to pull her attention back to the present. present. When she finally responded, clearly flustered, he asked if she was feeling unwell. Tessia quickly dismissed his concern. There was still much work to be done today, and she wasn't about to let a distraction get in the way of her duties. Just then, Tessia's sharp eyes shifted toward the disturbance. Her gaze landed on the standoff. Nicholas, still fuming, muttered a final warning to Arthur, threatening him not to cross paths again between classes. But Clive, the student council vice president, was already evaluating the situation more seriously. He quickly identified Nicholas as a promising student from House Prael, one of the more talented second years. His eyes then shifted to Arthur, a boy with striking red hair, clearly a first year. Clive didn't recognize him from any of the noble prospective student gatherings, which led him to conclude that Arthur must be a commoner. Just as Nicholas reached toward his dimensional ring again to draw his sword, both Tessia and Lilia, walking alongside the council, shared a chilling thought. They knew Nicholas would regret it, because if Arthur got serious, things could escalate far beyond a simple duel. Before the sword could leave the ring, Tessia stepped forward and challenged him with a voice so cold it froze him in place. Nicholas turned toward her and instantly recognized the danger. His confidence cracked as fear crept into his expression. Tessia's presence was not just intimidating, it was absolute. Nicholas tried to cover up his intentions. He stammered that this had all been a misunderstanding, claiming he had merely accepted a duel from the dwarf, and Arthur had interfered. Arthur simply smiled and waved toward Tessia, calling out to her casually. But before Tessia could respond, Lilia ran up to Arthur with concern, demanding to know what had happened. Tessia looked between the two of them a bit surprised and asked if they knew each other. Lilia explained that Arthur's father had worked closely with her own for years, and they had been friends since then. Arthur, without thinking, added that they had also been living together for a while. His words caused a moment of confusion, especially for Lilia, whose face turned red. She panicked and clarified quickly that what Arthur said sounded misleading. Though technically not wrong, Arthur just shrugged in response, while Tessia blinked, clearly puzzled at the dynamic between them. At that moment, Clive addressed Nicholas directly. He demanded an explanation for what had just occurred. Nicholas, flustered, insisted that he wasn't actually going to hurt Arthur. He was only trying to scare him. He said that even though Arthur had interrupted the duel, he had no intention of following through with violence. Clive seemed almost ready to settle the matter with a warning, but Tessia's voice cut in sharply. She reminded everyone that drawing a weapon outside of a sanctioned duel was a serious offense. She made her point clear. If anyone dared to try raising a weapon near her or any other student like that again, suspension would be immediate, and if they ever tried to attack her, expulsion would be the least of their worries. She looked Nicholas dead in the eyes and asked one final time, did he still dare? Faced with her gaze and the weight of her words, Nicholas lost all courage. His face paled, and his anger dissolved into fear. Lowering his head, he bowed deeply toward Arthur, muttering an apology and admitting that he had acted recklessly. Arthur didn't reply. He simply gave a low whistle and turned away. On the courtyard grounds, tension had just begun to fade when Tessia turned sharply toward Arthur. She questioned him, clearly upset that a fight had almost broken out on the very first day of school. Internally, Tessia's thoughts were filled with worry. Her grandfather had told her Arthur wanted to keep a low profile, but if he kept getting into confrontations like this, especially overpowering seniors so easily, it wouldn't be long before attention flooded his way. That thought troubled her deeply. Arthur, however, stood his ground. He was frustrated, not just by the misunderstanding, but by how quickly Tessia had assumed he was the one causing trouble. He reminded her that she had only seen the last few moments of what happened. Nicholas had been seconds away from truly harming another student, and Arthur had stepped in to prevent something worse. Without him, the situation could have spiraled far beyond control. Elijah tried to calm the tension, suggesting that both sides had a point, but Arthur's tone had already grown cold, and as he turned to leave, his sarcastic apology rang louder than intended. Everyone, including Tessia, was left stunned by the sudden chill in his words. Before Arthur could walk away, Clive stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. Clive was angry, questioning Arthur's behavior and accusing him of lacking manners. He claimed it must be due to Arthur's background. Tessia's eyes widened in horror, realizing things were about to get worse. She warned Clive to stop, but he refused. He believed Arthur needed to be reminded of his place, but Arthur had had enough. Looking over his shoulder with quiet frustration, he released a wave of pressure. Clive stumbled backward and fell hard onto the ground, his mana shield barely saving him from worse. Lilia rushed to Clive's side, checking if he was okay, while Arthur simply turned and walked away without another word. His silence echoed louder than anything he might have said. Later that day, Tessia paced nervously in her dorm room. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess. She felt guilty and conflicted. She had only been trying to protect Arthur, trying to stop him from doing something reckless that could get him expelled or stripped of his privileges. But maybe she had gone too far. Arthur hadn't even drawn a weapon, and unlike most students, Arthur himself was a weapon. Still, she couldn't shake the frustration and confusion in her chest. Her mind wandered again to what Arthur had said about living with Lilia. That detail bothered her more than she wanted to admit. How did that even happen? Did Arthur just go around finding girls to live with? It made no sense. She felt like everything was spinning out of control. Tessia buried her face in in her pillow, muffling her screams. She blamed everything on Director Goodsky for making her student council president. If not for this responsibility, she could have greeted Arthur the way she truly wanted to, with warmth and excitement, not formality and reprimands. Instead, their reunion had turned into an awkward clash. Just then, Clive knocked on her door. He had come to check on her, noticing how drained she'd looked during their later meetings. Tessia, still frustrated, told him she was fine. After all, she wasn't the one thrown onto the ground. Clive, still shaken from earlier, asked about Arthur again. He couldn't understand how a first year could talk to her that way. He even offered to report the matter to the director, but Tessia had no patience left. She cut him off, clearly done with the discussion, and told him to let the matter rest. She listened as his footsteps faded down the hall, then dropped back onto her bed. She sighed in exhaustion. Everything had become a mess so quickly, and to make it worse, Arthur had grown up looking effortlessly handsome. She already knew how much attention he would attract at school. That thought alone made her groan and bury her face in the pillow once again, letting out another muffled, frustrated scream. It wasn't the kind of reunion she had imagined, not even close. Arthur and Elijah finally arrived at their dorm building after a long walk across the vast campus. The grounds of Xyrus Academy were far larger than either of them had expected, stretching with endless buildings, stone paths, and courtyards that made exploring feel like wandering a city. Elijah, still full of energy despite the long day, marveled at the size of the academy. Arthur, however, remained quiet, his mind elsewhere. The events earlier with Tessia and Clive still lingered in his thoughts. Elijah noticed and teased him gently about tossing the student vice president onto the ground. Arthur grumbled, admitting it was still on his mind, though there was more to it. Normally, he wouldn't have let things get to him, but something about Tessia's scolding had irritated him. She wasn't wrong, and yet her words had cut deeper than they should have. Maybe it was because it came from her. Trying to shrug it off, Arthur told himself what was done, but his thoughts didn't settle easily. A knock at the door pulled them out of the conversation. Arthur opened it, only to find Cynthia Goodsky, the director of Xyrus Academy, standing there. Her appearance was unexpected and commanded immediate respect. Elijah, stunned to see her up close, bowed deeply in awe. Cynthia greeted him kindly, recognizing him by name and mentioning Vincent, which made Elijah beam. Arthur welcomed her in, and Elijah quickly excused himself, offering to bring drinks from downstairs. Cynthia accepted the offer with a smile, her presence calm yet powerful. Once they were seated, she gently reminded Arthur, as always, to call her by her first name. Arthur, in return, gave his usual firm refusal. Their playful exchange hinted at the mutual respect between them, but Cynthia's expression shifted as she studied him. She noted a change, not just in his bond Sylvie, but in Arthur himself. Her mana senses told her something was missing. She could only detect wind and earth attributes. Arthur held up his hand, showing her the artifact Gideon had crafted. It was the seal that masked his other two elemental affinities. Cynthia gave a soft sigh, a mixture of disappointment and understanding. She had hoped to boast about having a rare quadra-elemental student under her guidance, but she respected Arthur's reasons. Arthur opened up and explained. He had made a dangerous enemy during his time as an adventurer. For now, it was safer to hide his full strength and avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Cynthia, with her usual sharp insight, understood the weight of what he said. Referring to Lucas Wykes, she remarked that calling such a powerful and influential person merely troublesome was bold, and made her wonder what kinds of enemies Arthur would eventually face in the future. Arthur, still a boy by appearance, couldn't help but chuckle at her ominous tone. It wasn't the kind of thing most people said to a 12-year-old. Cynthia laughed with him, apologizing for sounding so grim. Arthur shifted the topic towards something that had been on his mind. He wanted her help with something more specific. He explained his wish to take higher-level mana theory classes, particularly those focused on deviance. It wasn't a matter of showing off. He would still attend classes meant for his age group, but his curiosity about deviant mana manipulation had grown too strong to ignore. He had hit a wall in his understanding, and unlike the other forms of magic, deviation magic was something his past world had never known. That alone made it fascinating and urgent for him to master. Cynthia listened with an amused smile. She had expected this from him. She agreed without hesitation, which caught Arthur off guard. He stared at her suspicious. That was too easy. Just then, the dorm door burst open. Elijah stormed in, yelling dramatically as he accused Arthur of being rude to the director. He scolded him for daring to question her kindness. But Cynthia waved off the moment and admitted she did have an ulterior motive. That silenced Elijah instantly. She told Arthur about the student council, a body that maintained order and represented the academy's best. But this year, she had decided to create something different, something more direct, a group that didn't just protect the school's rules, but enforce them. This new group was called the Disciplinary Committee. She wanted wanted Arthur to join it. Arthur blinked, confused. He asked if this kind of role was even suited for a first-year student. After all, he wasn't even officially a battle mage. Cynthia simply reminded him, her school, her rules. Arthur quickly backtracked, trying to escape the offer by refusing the extra theory classes. He'd just learned from books in the library, but Cynthia calmly shut that option down too. The books on deviance weren't available to underclassmen, and even most upperclassmen needed to prove themselves as actual deviants before gaining access, which she noted Arthur currently couldn't do, at least not openly. Elijah, still standing to the side, couldn't help but feel like he was watching two old friends having a casual argument, not a student and the school's director negotiating something as serious as this. Cynthia added more to her offer. The disciplinary committee wasn't just for rule enforcement. It was built with strong individuals in mind. Arthur would get teammates he could spar with, peers who could match him in strength, maybe even push him. And to sweeten the deal further, she promised him private access to a restricted training facility on campus. Arthur leaned forward. She had said the disciplinary committee members were chosen for their strength, so naturally, a question followed in his mind. Did that mean what he thought? Before he could fully voice it, Cynthia confirmed it. Despite pressure from House Wykes to assign Lucas a seat on the committee, she had turned them down. She had waited, strategically, confidently, hoping Arthur would accept instead. She had clearly planned this far in advance. Arthur couldn't help but be both impressed and slightly irritated. Cynthia always seemed one step ahead. Giving in, Arthur finally agreed, but with one condition. The training facility she mentioned better be mana rich. Cynthia responded instantly that it already was. With a snap of her fingers, she tossed a set of custom-made uniforms toward him. The fabric was smooth and crisp, and the embroidery bore the crest of the disciplinary committee. Arthur caught it and stared at it silently. She had this uniform prepared before he agreed. That annoyed him more than it should have. It was another sign she knew exactly how he would respond, like the whole meeting had already been played out in her head. Before leaving, Cynthia gave one last comment, lighthearted but pointed. She told Arthur to reconcile soon with the student council president. Holding grudges against one's childhood friend, she hinted, wasn't a good look. As the door closed behind her, Arthur was left in silence, until a dark shape blocked the light in front of him. Elijah stood over him, slack-jawed, staring like he had just seen a ghost. It took a moment before Elijah found his voice. The word Tessia Earlith and childhood friend had broken his brain. Later, as they walked together toward dinner, the conversation resumed. Arthur tried to explain. He had always meant to tell Elijah eventually, but it just never came up. It was something that had simply happened, nothing planned or hidden. Elijah, being Elijah, tried to brush it off, but not without some drama. He brought up his own so-called childhood friend, a girl named Helgarth, clearly made up, but delivered with the seriousness of a grand confession. Arthur humored him, pretending to admire this imaginary girl, though his deadpan reply made it clear he saw right through the nonsense. Then Elijah, unable to hold back, began listing Arthur's unintended entourage. Lilia, Princess Kathleen, and now even Princess Tessia. What next? Was Arthur going to charm the gods? Arthur tried to deny any flirting, insisting he hadn't even done anything, but that only made it worse in Elijah's eyes. If Arthur could gather attention without trying, then it had to be some kind of supernatural charisma. Pheromones even. Elijah, now clinging to him dramatically, claimed he wanted some of those powers too. That was why they got along, because both of them were weird. Sylvie put an end to the nonsense by jumping up and smacking Elijah on the head, dragging him back. As they walked into the dining hall, Arthur noticed the sudden quiet. Dozens of heads turned toward them. Whispers filled the room. Elijah leaned in, whispering that Arthur's reputation had spread fast. He advised him not to let it get to him. Arthur simply smirked. So popular already, it was amusing. Elijah rolled his eyes and muttered again. Arthur really was a weirdo. Arthur and Elijah quietly took their seats in the far corner of the dining hall, ignoring the stares and occasional whispers from nearby students. After getting their food, they began to eat in peace, hoping to avoid further attention. But that calm didn't last long. A group of battle mage students strutted over to their table, their leader wearing an air of arrogance. He introduced himself loudly as Charles Ravenpour II, from the well-known noble family, clearly expecting recognition and admiration. Instead, Elijah looked up with an expression of pure confusion and mispronounced it as Ravenpoop family. Arthur burst out laughing, unable to hold it back. The insult didn't go unnoticed. Students nearby, already listening in, began to snicker. Charles slammed his fist down on their table, demanding respect and reminding them of his noble status. But that only made the laughter around him grow louder. With growing anger, Charles turned his attention to Elijah. He accused him of throwing away an opportunity to associate with someone of higher standing, all because of Arthur, whom he called scholar trash. He couldn't understand why Elijah would defend someone beneath him, but Elijah stood firm. He shouted back that he would never side with someone who insulted his best friend. friend. They were all students at Xyrus Academy, all mages, and no title or bloodline gave anyone the right to look down on others. Charles sneered at the idea of equality. He dismissed it as political theater, nothing more than empty words from the student council. According to him, reality was different, and he intended to show Elijah just how different. Without warning, Charles raised his hand and swung it toward Arthur, but was immediately met with a sharp shock as his own arm was flung backward by an invisible force. He staggered back in confusion, unable to comprehend what had just hit him. He hadn't even seen Arthur move. Refusing to accept it, Charles charged again, this time channeling mana into his fist. But before he could land the blow, Elijah stepped in front of Arthur, shielding him. Arthur, watching carefully, knew he could likely protect himself with magic. But Elijah couldn't afford to take a hit like that. The situation had turned dangerous. Just as Arthur began to prepare a counter, a powerful wave of deviant magic surged through the air. Without a word, thick vines burst up from the ground, wrapping tightly around Charles's arms and legs. His movement was instantly halted. He froze in panic, staring at the vines in horror. They were strong, pulsing with mana. He couldn't break free, no matter how much he struggled. Arthur turned his head and spotted a figure standing silently near the entrance. It was Tessia Erlith. As vines still bound Charles tightly, Arthur paused, weighing his next move. Using magic directly would only land him and Elijah in trouble. But then, a mischievous idea took shape in his mind, one that didn't require any spells. Charles, red with fury, shouted threats as he struggled. He barked about his noble status, ready to run crying to his mother. But suddenly something changed. The oppressive pressure surrounding Arthur made Charles freeze in place. The air around him seemed heavier, more dangerous. Arthur stepped closer, his voice laced with cold clarity. He spoke of the arrogance of noble children, how they beat their chests, flaunted their names and status, but only brought shame to their families through actions like this. But Charles didn't back down. He insisted that putting trash in their place was a source of pride, not shame. Elijah, watching closely, grew tense. He could sense Arthur was on the edge, and although he wanted to help, he wasn't sure how, or even if he should. As Arthur raised his hand, charged faintly with mana, Charles scoffed at the idea that anything could be done while he was restrained. He thought himself untouchable, but Arthur didn't attack him physically. He didn't need to. With a swift motion, Arthur pulled Charles's pants down. The effect was immediate and devastating. For a moment, Charles didn't even register what had happened, but then he looked down. The reality hit him. Gasps spread across the room. Then came the laughter, sharp, uncontrollable, echoing from every table. Students burst out in mockery and amusement. Charles's face turned crimson as he screamed at them to stop looking, trying to wriggle free from the vines. Arthur simply turned and walked out. Elijah, still laughing under his breath, looked after him. As Arthur stepped outside, the cool autumn air greeted him. His breath clouded in front of him as he stepped away from the building. A few feet to his left stood Tessia. Her presence was calm, yet unmissable. Arthur approached her with a nod of gratitude, acknowledging what she had done. Though Tessia said nothing at first, the look in her eyes made it clear. She knew Arthur hadn't needed her help, but he thanked her anyway. She had saved him, and more importantly, Elijah, from being punished. They stood there in silence. A long, heavy pause settled between them, both of them unsure of what to say, yet not wanting to walk away. Then, as if they had shared the same thought at the same moment, they both leaned forward to bow in apology, only to headbutt each other hard. The tension broke instantly. Arthur clutched his head, laughing through the pain, joking that he might have cracked his chin. Tessia, grumbling, held her forehead and refused to look up. She muttered that it only hurt because it really did hurt, pointing at her swelling forehead. Arthur gently asked if she was crying. In response, she leaned against his shoulder, her uneven breaths making her chest rise and fall. In that quiet moment, Tessia admitted something she had held back for too long. She thought Arthur hated her, but Arthur reassured her that even if he got angry, even if they clashed, he would never hate her. Tessia's voice softened as she admitted what was really on her heart. She didn't want Arthur to get mad at her. Not now, not ever. Her words trembled with honesty, and Arthur felt the weight of them. He accepted it. He admitted that this time he had been the one in the wrong. He knew she had only been looking out for him, and he shouldn't have lashed out the way he did. But Tessia didn't let it rest on his shoulders alone. She confessed her own mistake, calling him out in public, letting the pressure of her new title cloud her judgment. She was still learning what it meant to be student council president, still finding the balance between responsibility and friendship. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps rushing toward them. Elijah came barreling in mid-sentence, clearly eager to share what had happened after Charles, Ravenpoop, had escaped the vines. But the moment he saw Tessia wrapped in Arthur's arms, he froze. His mouth hung open, his voice vanished. With an awkward chuckle and a mumbled excuse, Elijah spun around and darted off, giving Arthur a knowing glance. Sylvie leaped up onto Tessia's lap, licking her cheeks with a squeak of approval. Arthur chuckled softly at the sight before standing and gently offering Tessia a hand. Then with a small smile, he asked her to take a walk with him. The two wandered together beneath the moonlight, the cool breeze brushing against them as they shared the quiet of the academy grounds. Tessia spoke first, still processing everything that had happened. She couldn't believe all that Arthur had experienced while adventuring. Her voice carried wonder and a hint of of envy. Arthur responded, mentioning how he never knew Director Goodsky had been so close with his grandfather. It explained how she seemed to know so much about him. Tessia admitted that her connection to Cynthia was one of the reasons she had become her disciple. Arthur, in turn, gave her credit, believing her talent had more to do with it than anything else. But inside, Tessia was spiraling. As she walked beside him, she noticed everything. The way Arthur carried himself, the strength behind each step, the calm confidence in his posture. He had grown, not just taller or stronger, but more composed, more focused. And his face, Tessia could hardly look at it without remembering the memories they once shared. She felt jealous. Jealous of the girl named Jasmine, the one who had been at his side during the last 2 years. She wished she had been the one to explore the world with him. Arthur noticed her silence. He asked if something was wrong. Tessia quickly brushed it off with a nervous laugh and denied everything. Moments later, they realized they had already returned to the dorms. The walk had flown by. Just as Tessia was about to turn away, Arthur stopped her. He reached into his coat and pulled out something glowing faintly with mana, the beast core of the Elderwood Guardian. Then, without ceremony, he held it out to her. It was his gift, a present to celebrate her becoming a dual elemental mage. Tessia froze, overwhelmed. She tried to refuse. Something this rare and valuable, she didn't think she could accept it, but Arthur insisted. To him, this was the perfect gift for her, something that matched her, meant for her. And without giving her time to argue, he smiled and told her to get some rest. They both had a big day ahead. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her speechless at the entrance. Tessia stood still, the core held tightly in her hands. Her chest was warm, her emotions tangled. She looked down at the glowing item, stunned by how casually he had handed something so precious to her, as if it meant nothing. But it did mean something. To her, it meant everything. Arthur slowly opened the door to his room, careful not to wake Elijah in case he had already fallen asleep. But what he saw made him jump back in surprise. Elijah was wide awake, sitting upright, wrapped in a blanket like a cocoon, his bloodshot eyes staring directly at Arthur. Arthur flinched, startled by the eeriness of it all. He muttered in disbelief, taken aback by Elijah's theatrics. Elijah, however, was not joking. He pointed at a spot across from him and demanded Arthur to sit and explain what he had seen earlier that night. Arthur, feeling cornered, gave in and sat down with a nervous chuckle, ready to face the interrogation. Elijah, in a theatrical voice filled with despair, brought up the moment Tessia, who he now referred to as the lunar goddess, had leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder. The nickname confused Arthur at first, but Elijah explained it with dramatic flair. According to the students at Xyrus Academy, Tessia was like the moon, beautiful, glowing, yet always distant and out of reach. But somehow, Arthur had managed to touch that moon. He had even snuggled with it. Before Elijah could go on, a pillow flew into his face. Arthur had enough of the nonsense and told him to sleep. Elijah gave up with a sigh, falling back onto the bed and surrendered. The next morning came early. Arthur was already dressed and fastening the shoulder strap of the knife that marked his position on the disciplinary committee. Later, Arthur arrived at the auditorium through the back entrance. He fixed his shirt and vest, making sure he looked presentable. Though he was tired and a little nervous, he also felt curious, ready to see what the strongest students of Xyrus Academy looked like. As Arthur opened the door, a thunderous roar greeted him. His hair was blown back from the force of it. Sylvie, who had been perched on his head, clung tightly to avoid being thrown off. In front of him stood a massive beast, about 6 feet tall on all fours. To most, it would have looked like a terrifying creature, but to Arthur, compared to Sylvie's dragon form, it only looked like a giant kitten trying too hard to be scary. From the side, a student peeked out, clearly amused and slightly disappointed. It was obvious this had been a test. Arthur asked if this had been a prank to check how tough he was. The student introduced himself as Kai Cressless, a 4th year, clearly someone with seniority. He questioned if Arthur's placement was due to his abilities, or perhaps some deeper, hidden connection. He leaned in, muttering something cryptic about blood not lying, leaving Arthur momentarily confused. Kai quickly brushed it off as an old saying and extended his hand. Arthur shook it, introducing himself formally and also presenting Sylvie, his bond. Kai's expression flickered with curiosity. Internally, he wondered what kind of beast Arthur had bonded with that could make Grotter, the giant creature they had used to test him, so submissive. Then a loud, brash voice echoed across the hallway. The words criticized the lack of real men on the committee, accusing the new arrival of being just another delicate, pretty boy. Arthur scanned the room and instantly recognized the speaker, or at least he thought he did. His mind went back to the conversation with Elijah the night before. The memory of a certain name slipped out of his mouth before he could think. Helgarth. But the response came quick and sharp. The muscular, aggressive girl glared at him and demanded to know who that was. She introduced herself instead as Dora Drea Origward, a 1st year just like Arthur. Arthur, caught off guard, quickly laughed it off. He extended his hand to greet her and introduced himself as Arthur Leywin, trying to keep things civil, but Dora Drea wasn't one for formalities. She slapped his hand away and scolded him for being too stiff. Before Arthur could process more of her presence, Kai interrupted and called the two of them to join the others. Apparently, Director Goodsky hadn't told anyone much about Arthur, his name, background, or even what to expect. Naturally, Naturally, curiosity was running high among the other committee members. Dora, without hesitation, stormed ahead and shouted to the others that the final member had arrived. Arthur followed her into a massive room that looked like it was designed to hold formal events. Inside, 5 students were already waiting. Among them, Arthur immediately recognized Curtis Glader. Curtis smiled widely and exclaimed in joy, confirming that it was indeed Arthur. Arthur, not surprised by the coincidence, greeted him with familiarity. Curtis then explained how Kai had used his bond, Grotter, to try and intimidate Arthur, though clearly it had backfired. Arthur was surprised to learn the giant mana beast from earlier belonged to Curtis. He asked if it was the same world lion Curtis had purchased at the auction during their first meeting. Curtis confirmed it, saying they had formed an equal contract after the beast reached A class. Arthur congratulated Curtis with a handshake and a genuine smile. Curtis returned the gesture, officially welcoming Arthur to the disciplinary committee. Dora, surprised, asked if they already knew each other. Curtis chuckled and replied that it wasn't just him. A soft voice came from the stairs, and Arthur turned to see a familiar figure descending. It was Princess Kathleen Glader. She greeted him calmly, and Arthur returned the gesture with respect, addressing her by her title. Then another voice called out with playful sarcasm. A tall blonde elf approached, clearly older than Arthur but with a familiar energy. Arthur looked at him, puzzled, until the elf introduced himself. Firith Ivsar III. The name triggered a memory, and Arthur remembered the younger elf from his visit to the Elven Kingdom. With a mischievous grin, Arthur pointed at him and called him Feifei, causing Feyrith's face to flush red with embarrassment. Feyrith immediately corrected him, reminding Arthur to use his proper name. He also demanded a bit of respect since even though they were both first years, he was still a few years older. Arthur couldn't resist teasing. He recalled the time he had knocked Feyrith out with a single punch, adding that it had been a good memory. Feyrith, now visibly irritated, accused Arthur of doing it on purpose. Another student stepped forward. She was graceful, yet carried herself with strength, her scarlet red hair just touching her chin. With a confident tone, she introduced herself as Claire Bladeheart. A 6th-year battle mage student, Claire also revealed that she was the official leader of the disciplinary committee. Hearing the name Bladeheart, Arthur immediately thought of Caspian Bladeheart. He asked about the connection, and Claire confirmed it. Caspian was her uncle. She shared how he had begun training her almost the moment she awakened. Much of her style, she said, came directly from him. Arthur was impressed, though he tried to keep it casual. Next came a different sort of presence. A cold, almost arrogant voice introduced a tall, lean student with sharp eyes, Theodore Maxwell. Without wasting time, Theodore threw a veiled insult at Arthur, questioning the committee's standards for recruitment. Then, as if to emphasize his point, he extended his hand. Arthur reached out politely and shook it. Instantly, Arthur felt the change. His weight increased drastically, as if something invisible had slammed down on him. The ground beneath his feet cracked. He could tell Theodore was a deviant, a rare type of mage, capable of controlling gravity. Arthur's body strained, but thanks to the assimilation he had undergone with Sylvia's dragon will, he held firm. Using mana, he strengthened himself just enough to endure the pressure without showing weakness. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stared directly into Theodore's eyes. That silent challenge was enough. Theodore pulled away, muttering that Arthur wasn't bad. Then he turned and walked off. A whistle echoed from the group, breaking the tension. Kai, amused, mentioned that Arthur clearly had more to offer than just good looks. He even teased that when Theodore had done the same gravity trick on Firith, the elf had fallen flat on his face. Firith, red with embarrassment, defended himself by claiming the difference between augmenters like Arthur and conjurers like him was too vast to compare. His pride still stung. Before the tension could rise again, Claire clapped her hands, taking control of the room. She reminded everyone to stop messing around and get ready. Today was the day of the Club Rush announcement, and it would be the first time the disciplinary committee officially introduced itself to the entire academy. This was their moment. Arthur, surprised, asked what was required of him. Curtis answered casually. There was nothing to prepare. The student council would be doing the talking. The committee just needed to walk in and look imposing. Arthur smirked, knowing that the presence of a giant A-class mana beast like Grotter beside them would make quite an impression. Claire agreed and called the group to action. It was time to show the entire student body what the disciplinary committee stood for, and what would happen to anyone who broke the academy's rules. Later, as the club rush reached its peak, the announcement rang through the auditorium. The student council declared the formation of a new committee, one handpicked by the director herself, a group tasked with enforcing discipline, handling disputes, and maintaining peace throughout Xyrus Academy. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Then, with spotlights blazing and the crowd's attention focused forward, the student council formally introduced them. The disciplinary committee had arrived. The moment Arthur stepped into the classroom, whispers followed him like shadows. A few students murmured about his appearance, impressed by his looks, status, and even Sylvie's cuteness. Some wondered how someone so young, a first year, had earned a position among the Academy's elite enforcers. Others didn't seem to care about the politics at all. They simply found Arthur their type. He quietly took a seat near the back, with Elijah beside him, who leaned in with a grin, clearly enjoying the attention Arthur was receiving. Elijah joked about his sudden popularity, teasing him about the rare black uniform that practically announced his identity. Arthur, still adjusting to the shift in how people perceived him, replied humbly. He hadn't expected this much attention, especially not for joining the committee. Before he could say more, the classroom doors opened sharply and a man walked in with confident steps. Tall, composed, and with an air of authority, he made his way to the front and slammed a folder down onto the podium. The sharp thump silenced the murmurs. This was the professor, Avius. Arthur instinctively scanned the man's mana presence but found nothing detectable. That alone told him the professor was strong, a conjurer with immense control over his core. Avius immediately commanded the room, introducing himself as the instructor for fundamentals of mana theory. He acknowledged the students' divided attention, but with a smile, warned them they wouldn't be bored in his class. There would be plenty of assignments, and they would start with an important topic. Avius dove into the core differences between augmenters and conjurers, using history to explain why conjurers had long held an edge. He spoke of mana veins and mana channels, how conjurers were naturally more efficient at absorbing ambient mana, making it easier for them to ascend in core levels. Meanwhile, augmenters had an advantage in distributing mana through their bodies. But then came the twist. Avius explained how, as mages reached higher core stages, the gap between the two narrowed. In fact, a well-trained augmenter who also honed their body could eventually surpass a conjurer if both reached the same level. It wasn't about starting advantages. It was about what one did with them. The classroom stirred at that point. A few conjurer students disagreed, raising their hands, challenging the point with recorded duels and hypothetical situations. Arthur stayed quiet, observing. He could feel the tension, but he also noted that Avius wasn't shutting them down. The professor encouraged the debate, allowing space for opinions, yet holding firm to his central point. By the time the massive bell in the tower rang, the classroom felt different. The students didn't leave with all the answers, but they left with new questions. Most had open minds now, and Arthur could see it in their eyes. As they packed up their things, Elijah reminded Arthur that they'd meet at lunch. The two friends parted ways, each headed toward their next destination in the academy. As Arthur moved through the crowded hallway toward his next class, he felt the weight of several gazes following him. Some students recognized his face, others noticed the distinct black uniform of the disciplinary committee. Whispers passed from one to another as he walked with calm purpose toward the classroom for practical mana manipulation. Once inside, Arthur took a seat and waited quietly as students began to trickle in. Before long, a familiar presence approached. It was Kathleen, also in her black uniform. She asked if she could sit beside him, and Arthur silently shifted his bag to give her space. Suddenly, a loud and overly confident voice echoed through the room. Fairith walked in, announcing himself in dramatic fashion. He called Arthur his rival and greeted Kathleen with flair, then sat down beside Arthur. Arthur raised an eyebrow internally. Fairith's dislike for him had been obvious before, so why was he sitting so close now? Before he could dwell on that thought, the professor entered. Arthur immediately recognized him. Geist, the drunk from the streets he'd encountered days ago. This time, Geist wore light armor and a wide grin, clapping his hands to grab everyone's attention. Geist introduced the class with energy, declaring that it would be focused entirely on practical learning, hands-on demonstrations rather than theory. When Geist's gaze landed on Arthur, his cheerful smile twisted into something sharper. Deep down, Geist still carried the humiliation from their last meeting. Arthur could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a lesson, this was a setup. Geist made a show of welcoming the disciplinary committee members and hinted that the class would benefit from seeing what their protectors were truly capable of. Arthur immediately saw through the bait, but before he could react, someone else took it. Fairith stood up confidently and offered himself as the volunteer. He addressed the entire class and the professor with pride, stating that he would represent the disciplinary committee and demonstrate their strength. Arthur resisted the urge to sigh. Of course, Fairith would jump into the spotlight like that. Geist's grin widened. He accepted Fairith's challenge and motioned for him to come to the stage. The tension shifted as the students leaned forward, excited for the match. Geist made sure to remind everyone that he was an augmenter and would only use long-range attacks. It was a clever move. If he lost, he could say it was because he limited himself. If he won, it would still be humiliating for the student. As Professor Geist winked at Fairith, laughter filled the room. With a casual tone, Geist began chanting a few incantations. A soft glow appeared around the stage, an arena-sized mana barrier to keep the rest of the class safe from stray magic. With the space secured, the duel began. Faerith wasted no time. He raised his wand and summoned his spell. A moment later, the domain spell activated. Water surged across the arena, flooding the floor until it lapped at his knees, creating the perfect terrain for his water element to thrive. From within the swirling current, a twisting stream rose up, quickly shaping itself into a massive serpent that coiled protectively around him. It was impressive. Arthur noted this was no basic attack. It was a domain-level spell, something only higher-tier mages typically used. Faerith had gone all in, but Geist wasn't phased. A cold blue flame ignited along his arm, a color far more dangerous than the usual red or orange. Arthur watched closely, quietly acknowledging that for all his childish behavior, Geist was not just talk. That flame meant real danger. The water serpent lunged. It hit with immense force. A loud hiss and a burst of steam swallowed the stage as water clashed with fire. Simultaneously, a fireball burst through the mist, streaking directly toward Faerith. His face turned pale. Faerith barely managed to form another shield of water. The hastily formed layer weakened the fireball, but couldn't stop it entirely. By the time it hit, it was no bigger than a fingernail, yet it burned a hole through his uniform and sent him stumbling backwards. He landed hard, soaked, and humiliated. Then Geist emerged from the smoke, still smirking, casually juggling two more glowing fireballs. Faerith, shoulders slumped and pride bruised, conceded quietly and walked back to his seat, dripping and defeated. Arthur, still seated, observed everything with narrowed eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had been more about humiliation than education. It wasn't just a demonstration, it was Geist feeding his own ego at a student's expense. When Faerith sat down, Arthur reassured him. Despite the loss, Faerith had shown skill and courage. Geist, on the other hand, turned to the rest of the class with a smug expression. He claimed the outcome had surprised him, blaming the failure on his own overestimation. Then, scanning the students, Geist asked for another volunteer. His eyes lingered on both Kathleen and Arthur. Arthur began to move, but before he could stand, Kathleen rose. She gave the professor a polite bow and walked forward without a word. Calm and composed, she stepped into the arena. Professor Geist greeted her with exaggerated politeness, bowing dramatically, trying to turn the tension into amusement. But Kathleen remained still, her silence sharper than any blade. Without a word, she reached into her dimension ring and drew out her staff, calm and precise. The moment Geist clapped his hands, igniting a flicker of fire between his palms, Kathleen acted. Ice javelins shot out with incredible speed, her first attack swift and direct. Geist raised his flaming hands, catching the icy projectiles mid-air. The contact between the flames and javelins created a hiss as the ice melted instantly. He grinned and praised her, but Kathleen didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she conjured 5 more spinning javelins. This time, Kathleen didn't just attack, she controlled. The javelins flew at him again, and he responded with a defensive spell. Blue flames floated around him like glowing spirits, ember wisps. Arthur, watching from the seats, instantly recognized it. That was the same spell Lucas had once used. It was powerful, precise, and deadly when combined with other fire spells. Just as the javelins closed in, she willed them to shatter mid-air. 1,000 sharp shards of ice scattered in every direction toward Geist. Inside his mind, the professor admired her strategy. She had turned her attack into a storm of tiny blades, but he believed it still wasn't enough. With a sharp command, Geist unleashed the blue flames. Streams of fire surged forward toward Kathleen. She didn't react. Instead, she focused entirely on her final spell. Faerith and Arthur stood in shock. She wasn't defending herself. Kathleen completed the incantation. Ice shards began spinning violently in a wide formation, building up a whirling ice tornado around Geist. But by then, it was too late. The fire was already racing toward her. Arthur moved without hesitation. The professor had canceled the ember wisps, but not the fire streams. Those continued toward the princess at full speed. Arthur gathered wind mana in a concentrated burst as he ran toward the barrier. Just as the fire was about to hit Kathleen, Arthur extended his hand through the barrier and released the wind spell. It pushed Kathleen hard to the side, just enough for the fire to miss her completely. The blast collided with the interior of the barrier instead, vanishing in a harmless burst of steam. As the last of the melting ice cleared, Professor Geist looked around the arena expecting to see Kathleen, but instead, standing between him and the lingering fire was Arthur Leywin. Arthur had decided the professor's reckless game had gone too far. He questioned Geist's control over the situation, his voice steady but sharp. Geist, still trying to maintain his authority, insisted everything had been under control. He claimed the attack would have been cancelled in time, pretending concern for Kathleen's safety. But Arthur had seen that spell before. He knew the ember wisps couldn't be recalled once fired. Still, since Kathleen hadn't been harmed, he couldn't challenge the professor directly. Instead, Arthur made a quiet decision. If Geist wanted to prove something, Arthur would be the one to face it. He offered to take Kathleen's place, requesting the demonstration continue. Geist smirked, masking irritation behind fake amusement, and agreed. Arthur quickly turned to Kathleen and asked if she was okay. She assured him that she was, though she added that the intervention hadn't been even necessary, still she was grateful for his help. The professor gave Arthur the choice of combat method, hoping to provoke him or catch him off guard, but Arthur refused to play his games. He told Geist to fight however he wanted, and that indifference only fueled the professor's irritation. The slight twitch in Geist's brow revealed his growing frustration. Geist picked up his sword from where it lay embedded in the ground, while Arthur drew Dawn's ballad with calm focus. Without warning, Geist charged. His blade came down hard, the force behind it betraying his claim of going easy, but Arthur was ready. He parried the attack cleanly and controlled the fire it left behind with wind mana. Geist attacked again, faster and more aggressive each time, trying to push Arthur into a mistake, but Arthur never lost his rhythm. With no spells, just precise swordsmanship and mana-enhanced movements, Arthur continued to counter and evade every strike. Geist, clearly irritated, tried to insult him through gritted teeth, calling out the committee for only dodging. Arthur calmly responded by questioning why he should attack at all, especially when the esteemed professor couldn't even land a single hit. The words cut deep. Geist's forced smile disappeared as his expression twisted in anger. Then came a shift. Geist began to weave spells into his movements. His sword strikes became unpredictable, laced with bursts of flame. Without warning, he cast a spell, Flame Pillar, and a blue inferno erupted beneath Arthur, but Arthur didn't flinch. With perfect timing, he sidestepped the spell, the fire missing him by inches. Professor Geist charged at Arthur again, his blade slicing through the air with precision and force, but Arthur leaned back just in time, narrowly avoiding the attack. The movement threw him slightly off balance, but with a quick tap of his hand against the floor, he recovered his footing with remarkable control. Geist didn't let up. He leapt high into the air and came crashing down with his sword aimed to crush. Arthur slipped past the vertical strike just in time as Geist's blade slammed into the ground. Arthur's expression tightened. He was beginning to see the full power behind the professor's attacks. Geist, in contrast, only grinned wider, thrilled by the intensity of the exchange. Around them, a few students whispered nervously, wondering if they should alert the director or the student council. The duel had gone beyond a normal demonstration, but Arthur had no intention of backing down. In a blink, he closed the distance between them, wind mana swirling around the edge of his blade. He delivered a clean, precise strike aimed at Geist's throat. Surprised, the professor jumped back, farther than he needed to. A bead of sweat appeared on his temple. Arthur didn't pause. With explosive speed, he darted forward like a missile. Every swing of his sword left visible streaks of air in the wake, each one sharper and more refined than the last. The force of his assault began to push Geist back with every step. Dicathen watched in awe, noting how Arthur was forcing the professor into retreat. Even Ferrith admitted that Arthur was operating on an entirely different level. As Geist neared the edge of the arena, the flames on his sword flickered and dimmed under the relentless pressure. Arthur decided to finish it. Using earth magic, he caused the ground beneath Geist's next step to collapse slightly, just enough to break his rhythm. Although Geist managed to recover almost instantly, testament to his experience as a seasoned augmenter, that brief moment was all Arthur needed. Every trail of wind left behind by Arthur's earlier strikes now activated. The arena filled with movement as dozens of wind blades shot forward. Arthur's attacks accelerated, his sword vanishing into a blur, his speed surpassing anything the students had seen before. The protective barrier surrounding the arena strained under the pressure. It cracked and flickered violently until with a loud snap, it shattered. One final blade of wind slipped through, grazing the professor's neck and drawing a thin line of blood. Overwhelmed by the sheer number and intensity of attacks, Geist fell to the ground and rolled out of the ring. His body, protected by mana, prevented serious injury, but he lay flat on his back, his face pale, his confidence gone. Arthur stepped forward, planting his blade firmly in the ground beside Geist's neck. Then, withdrawing his sword, Arthur looked down at the man who had tried to humiliate him in front of everyone and spoke with calm respect. He thanked the professor for his guidance. As the sound of the bell echoed through the academy, Arthur stepped out of the classroom, quickly making his way through the halls. Ahead of him, Dicathen was already walking away, having packed up and left the room without delay. Wanting to catch up, Arthur picked up his pace and called out to her, but just before reaching her, he felt a firm hand grasp his shoulder from behind. It was Ferrith Ivsar. The proud elf gave Arthur a nod of approval, clearly trying to keep his dignity intact despite the earlier defeat. Ferrith admitted that Arthur's performance in the duel had been impressive, what he would expect from someone he now considered a rival. Arthur, not wanting to be arrogant, returned the compliment. He acknowledged Ferrith's effort and said that if Ferrith had known what kind of spell Geist was going to use, he likely would have prepared accordingly and done better. Ferrith laughed confidently, claiming that if he had known the professor would use such a powerful spell during what was meant to be a demonstration, the result would have been different, perhaps even a victory for him. Just then, Dicathen slowed her steps and turned to face them. Her gaze was sharp, focused directly on Arthur. She asked what he thought her mistakes had been during the duel. Arthur, a bit hesitant but honest, replied that her main mistake had been prioritizing her final spell while completely neglecting her defense. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, her silence heavy, but after a pause, she nodded slightly, accepted the criticism, and turned away without saying anything further. Ferrith, sensing the shift in mood, let out a small, awkward laugh. Then, with a quick goodbye, he disappeared down another hallway, leaving Arthur alone. The halls around him were now starting to fill again with students heading to their next classes. Sylvie, sitting calmly on his shoulder, tilted her head. She sensed something was off and asked Arthur why he seemed so down. Arthur gave a small smile. It wasn't anything serious, but deep down he was frustrated. Even though he had outmatched Geist using only his wind attribute, he realized just how far he still had to go. His current strength wasn't enough. He needed to work harder to reach the level he truly aimed for. Trying to shift focus, Arthur reminded himself that his next class was basics of artifacing. Unlike mana manipulation or swordplay, this subject was new to him, yet it fascinated him. He was curious to see if there were parallels between artificing in this world and the advanced technology from his previous life. With that thought, he entered the classroom. The room slowly filled with students. Most were gathering in pairs or small groups, taking seats beside their friends. Arthur glanced around to see if he recognized anyone, but saw no familiar faces. Then a girl, about his age, walked over and paused beside the stool next to him. With her head lowered, she asked quietly if the seat was taken. Arthur told her it wasn't, and that she was free to sit there. She thanked him and took the seat, still looking down nervously. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said something else. Arthur leaned in slightly, not catching it the first time. She raised her head slightly, her face going red, and introduced herself as Emily Watskin. In her nervousness, she stumbled over her words, accidentally asking Arthur to be her friend before correcting herself and saying it was nice to meet him. Arthur extended his hand toward the girl beside him, offering a friendly gesture. Since it was their first meeting, he suggested they begin as acquaintances. Emily nodded and reached out to shake his hand. Her palm was unexpectedly rough, and she quickly pulled away in embarrassment. She apologized, assuming her calloused skin must feel unpleasant. Arthur reassured her, holding up his sword hand to show the hardened patches from constant training. His own hands were covered in thick calluses, the marks of years of combat and discipline. That small moment of shared experience seemed to ease her nerves. Arthur, genuinely impressed, told her he was jealous of her dedication to creation. While his own path had been one of battle, learning how to destroy and survive, hers was about building and invention. There was something noble in that. She seemed surprised by his words and admitted she hadn't thought about it that way. Then, with a sheepish smile, she pointed out how mature he sounded for a 12-year-old. Arthur raised an eyebrow and reminded her that she was 12 as well. Emily agreed, but said it had been a while since anyone treated her like a kid, especially after creating the projection display artifact. Arthur was stunned. The device had been popular even outside of the academy. If she was already inventing that kind of technology at her age, she really was a prodigy. He gave her a respectful nod and told her it was an honor to be in the presence of a genius. But Emily just laughed and turned the compliment around. She teased Arthur for being the mysterious freshman with no background, a strange fox-like mana beast on his head, and the skills to humiliate a professor and seasoned adventurer. Her grin widened as she reminded him that this was a magic academy. Rumors and gossip spread fast. Before Arthur could respond, the classroom door burst open. The familiar voice of Gideon thundered through the room as he entered dramatically. Declaring his presence with theatrical flair, he called the students plebeians and asked them to feel honored to have him as their instructor. He scanned the room with exaggerated pride until his eyes landed on Arthur. Gideon feigned shock at seeing him, holding his face as if surprised, but Arthur just shook his head in quiet resignation. It was typical of the eccentric professor. The lecture began, but instead of diving into artificing theory, Gideon seemed more focused on boasting about his past achievements. He went on about the inventions he had made 20 years ago, then described another discovery from 3 years later, and then reminded the class of yet another accomplishment that he had apparently revolutionized. Arthur couldn't help but groan inwardly. It felt like Gideon was more interested in showing off than teaching anything useful. Suddenly, the window creaked open and an olive green owl flew inside. It flapped its wings once and landed squarely on Arthur's shoulder. Sylvie, perched on his head, growled softly, startled by the bird's unexpected arrival, but the owl remained completely calm, grooming itself as if this was perfectly normal. As Professor Gideon spotted the owl perched on Arthur's shoulder, he immediately recognized it as a summons from director Cynthia Goodsky. With his usual flair, he made a dramatic announcement in front of the entire class, saying that Arthur wouldn't get the privilege of hearing the rest of his so-called life-changing lecture. Arthur was dismissed, and the class chuckled at Gideon's over-the-top reaction. Emily, sitting beside Arthur, gave him a knowing look. She reminded him how quickly news traveled at Xyrus Academy, and this was just another example of it. As Arthur exited the classroom, he could hear Sylvie growling at the owl. The two creatures were still bickering like rivals, and he glanced between them with mild irritation. Inwardly, he sighed and asked how long they were planning to keep up this fight, though he knew neither of them would give in easily. When he reached the director's office, he noticed Kathleen leaving with a stern expression. She slammed the door behind her, which immediately gave Arthur a sense of unease. That couldn't be a good sign. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door and peeked inside. Cynthia Goodsky, the director of Xyrus Academy, welcomed him in and gestured for him to sit. Arthur quietly took his place in front of her desk. The green owl, Avier, left his shoulder and flew to rest on the window behind Cynthia, watching silently. immediately. Still unsure about the reason for the summons, Arthur quickly brought up the recent duel with Professor Geist. He assumed he was being reprimanded for stepping in during Kathleen's battle, and for going too far in his own, but Cynthia gently stopped him. She clarified that this wasn't about his fight with the professor. Arthur was confused. If not that, then what? Cynthia calmly asked how he would feel about becoming an interim professor for the practical mana manipulation class. Arthur froze. The idea sounded absurd to him. He even glanced behind him to check if someone else was there, certain this couldn't be meant for him, but Cynthia confirmed it with a smile. She had indeed been talking to him. Still unsure whether it was a joke, Arthur cautiously asked what Kathleen could have possibly told her to make her think he was qualified for such a task. With a playful wink, she warned him not to win the hearts of both royal princesses, or he might accidentally start a civil war. Arthur immediately told her not to joke about things like that. He hoped she was kidding about the teaching position too. After all, he hadn't even finished his first day at school. Was it really possible for a student to act as a professor? But Cynthia brushed aside his doubts. In her calm and amused tone, she assured him that yes, it was possible, as long as she approved. She explained that this wasn't unheard of. There had been cases of talented upperclassmen teaching certain subjects, so Arthur wasn't entirely unique. She ended her statement by reminding him, in her charming way, that he wasn't that special. Arthur looked at Cynthia, still trying to wrap his head around the strange offer, but one question still lingered. What would happen to Professor Geist? Cynthia gave him a calm yet firm answer. Geist had already been dismissed from the academy. She had launched an investigation the moment she heard about the incident, and with Princess Kathleen's testimony, there was nothing the professor could do to defend himself. What surprised Cynthia even more was how deeply shaken Kathleen had been. Arthur was quietly stunned. He hadn't thought Kathleen capable of showing such visible emotion. Amused, Arthur smirked inwardly at that. The princess always carried herself like ice, cold and unreadable. Still, he didn't understand Cynthia's true reason behind offering him a teaching role. What did she really want? Cynthia reassured him. She explained that there were no hidden motives this time. A spot had opened in the staff and she wanted him to fill it. It would be a good opportunity to build his reputation, she said, without having to challenge and defeat more professors in front of half the student body. Of course, stepping into a teaching role would place him in the spotlight, but Cynthia promised to support him if anything went wrong. Arthur still had his doubts. He pointed out that parents were likely to complain. After all, placing a 12-year-old student as a professor wasn't exactly normal. Cynthia didn't deny that. Parents might complain, yes, but she reminded him she was the director, and her decision would stand. She also made it clear that this was a better solution than simply canceling the class. And more importantly, wasn't it a better use of his time than attending a basic course he had already outgrown? Arthur gave it some thought. After everything that had happened today, staying low wasn't really an option anymore. His fight with Geist had already turned heads. With a quiet resolve, Arthur agreed. He would give it a shot. Cynthia smiled. She was confident he'd do well. As Arthur walked out of her office, Cynthia followed his figure through the window. There was a moment of silence as she watched him disappear into the hall. A small sigh escaped her lips. She whispered to herself, wondering aloud what it was about this boy that always kept her so alert. Negotiating with him was more nerve-wracking than dealing with royalty. Behind her, the green owl aviator ruffled his feathers and spoke in a voice filled with certainty. He said Arthur Leywin was no ordinary child. He had far more depth than anyone realized, mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. Cynthia turned to him, surprised. What made the owl so certain? Javier answered with a truth that left her stunned. Arthur's bond, Sylvie, was no simple mana beast. Her true form was that of a dragon. The weight of that revelation hit Cynthia hard. A dragon, one of the rarest, most powerful creatures in existence. But Javier didn't stop there. He said that once Sylvie reached maturity, even his own strength would be no match for hers. Then he offered a warning. Arthur should not be treated like a mere student. If given trust and respect, he could become the continent's greatest ally. But if betrayed, he could just as easily become the cause of its downfall. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.